there can be no doubt that UK politics is now firmly on an election footing. Our unelected Prime Minister may still be declining the opportunity to give us what we really want, which is a date for the next election. But that hasn't stopped our two biggest parties from getting into the swing of things. In the red corner, we had Keir Starmer coming out fighting with 6 key pledges. No, they're not pledges, they're not promises. Apparently Labour's discovered that the public has lost their appetite for promises and pledges. Instead, these are first steps. 6 first steps. That's one more step, promise or pledge, than the 5 Rishi Sunak in the blue corner gave us last year, none of which the PM really appears to have delivered on. I can't be the only one who treats big pledge announcements or first step announcements with the degree of cynicism they deserve. And there's plenty of overlap as well. Like Sunak, Starmer's pledging, promising, first stepping to cut NHS waiting lists. But as anyone who's been stuck for yonks waiting for treatment in the NHS, there's a huge difference between making a pledge and delivering on it, although Starmer is promising 40,000 extra doctor's appointments a week. Sunak promised to halve inflation, just about got there, but Starmer on Thursday promised to go further and stabilise the economy. Good luck with that. The newest of Starmer's, I'm going to call them pledges, please, it's just easier that way we all understand what we're talking about. The newest of Starmer's 6 pledges is to increase border security. He's been criticised, Labour, by some for not having a Rwanda-style project to boast about when it comes to dealing with migration. So Starmer's response is to launch a new border security command. That sounds frightening. Again, it's easy to promise this new approach, but no guarantee it will deliver and stop the boats. And the other 3 Starmer pledges I find are kind of more intriguing because they're noticeably different from anything the Tories have been pushing. So we've got the creation of Great British Energy, a new nationalised clean energy company, a crackdown on antisocial behaviour, and the recruitment of 6,500 new teachers. Labour sources claim the 6 pledges are consumer-focused issues expected to go down well in battleground areas where the party hopes to pick up swing voters. But they denied the pledges meant that other issues, such as housing and workers' rights, had been deprioritised. But that's, I guess, one of the disadvantages of selling yourself on just a handful of promises. With housing consistently rating as one of the very key issues for voters worry about, maybe Labour's missing a trick there. And how have the Tories responded to all of this? Well, again, to be fair, Sunak is clearly aiming to keep some of his powder dry for when he does eventually deign to give us a date for an election. But Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was out and about punching back where he could this week. And what did he have to persuade us to back the beleaguered Blues, who face a battering at the next election? Well, really, it was just the promise of more tax cuts. And if you believe the economy has turned the corner, as Hunt clearly does now, quite gung-ho yesterday, well, Jeremy Hunt anyway, further tax cuts are going to be on the way, he said, after acknowledging that families have been battered by the global shocks of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. He insisted the Conservatives had sheltered people's finances during this time. I'm not sure that's how it feels to me. And the impact on energy prices, caused by the war in Ukraine, that hit UK consumers hard, agreed, but much harder than French consumers because of decisions politicians like Jeremy Hunt have made. I don't expect the tax cuts he has in mind either to include the abolition of national insurance just yet, that Labour says would cost £46 billion uncosted. And that's really where we are this morning. The papers are filled with, Labour says Tories don't, their finances don't add up. The Tories say Labour finances, they don't add up. Your tax bill's going to go up by more than £2,000. Leaving all that aside for a moment, it's worth noting that the tax cuts that Hunt has already delivered over 3 budgets and autumn statements, taking national insurance down from 12p in the pound to 8p in the pound, have done little to shore up Tory fortunes. So I'm left wondering whether Hunt might go for something bigger as we get closer to whenever that election may be, a penny or 2 off income tax, rather than the less sexy downward movement of tax bans. But overall, dear listener, I just want to know whether you feel inspired by what you've seen the 2 main parties throw to us over the last week. And if not, why not? What is missing in the conversation, in the political conversation, in the pledges, the promises, or the first steps? What's missing? Well, listening to all of that is Paul Mason and Sir John Redwood. I'm going to turn first to Paul Mason, author and journalist, for some insight. Good morning to you, sir. Nice to see you, Paul.
Good morning, Matthew. And I should just say I am a Labour Party member and a Labour supporter, so I'm not neutral here.
Okay.
If Mr. Redwood on the other side, obviously everyone knows he's a Conservative politician.
Okay. What do you make of... What's your overall impression of where we are today with the papers basically accusing the parties accusing each other of being irresponsible?
It's a bit like that game Battleships, isn't it? Where you have to attack a square on the other side and try and guess what's in it. It's two parties trying to basically soften up the electorate for a debate about tax and spend and the quality of public services and the burden of tax that we have to pay to keep those public services. So when I look at the pledges and when I look at the mutual accusations, one figure sticks in my mind that you didn't mention, Matthew, which is half of all local councils think they will go bust in the next 5 years. So that means my bins don't get collected. It means that children in danger of domestic abuse don't get protected. That's what happens if a council goes bust. So whenever I hear a politician say, I'm going to cut taxes massively, I just ask them to tell us what will happen to public services. So I think the other thing I would say is what this kind of game of battleships, it's a kind of shadow boxing, that's another way of putting it, tells us is that we're overdue an election. We really should be having an election about this when both parties will be asked to state exactly what they will tax, what they will spend, how things are expected to work, rather than this kind of fantasy debate about what I think your spending plans mean according to me, which is what Jeremy Hunt basically did this week.
But what I can glean from what you just said there is tax and spend is going to be the main battleground of the next election.
Well, I actually don't think it will be because, look, as I say, I'm on the Labour side. I speak to Labour politicians, including front bench ones. What's the mood music among them? Everything they want to do has to be costed. So there will be some extra borrowing, no doubt, to do the Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, which means investing in solar power, investing in wind farms, cutting people's energy bills. You could say, well, we invest there to gain something on the other side. People get something. I actually think the election will be what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of country where councils go bust? Do we want to be the kind of country that can't protect its own borders? I think the electorate, voters, have a right to clear answers on everything. But the only way you're going to get it is if Rishi Sunak wakes up this morning, drinks his whatever it is, his Mexican Coke, and just decides, you know what, I'm going to give the electorate an election so we can get this over with. There's big decisions facing our country, and we need to be taking them. You can't with a government that's in the kind of fag end phase of a government. You need a new mandate, whether it's for Sunak or for Starmer.
What, if anything, is missing from, I suppose it's inherently the danger of coming up with a handful of issues and throwing them to the electorate. Immediately I saw the 6 pledges, 6 first steps yesterday. I thought, where's housing? Every opinion poll I look at suggests that housing is in the top 3 concerns for voters, and it's not in Labour's 6 key pledges. And then they say, well, it was in our previous manifesto, so that still stands. Is there anything key that you think is missing from these 6 first steps? Has he made a mistake limiting himself to 6 first steps?
Politicians understand that on the doorstep. I was out on the doorstep myself, in the local council elections, campaigning for Sadiq Khan, and when we are wrapped up in politics, journalists and politicians are wrapped up in it. On the doorstep, you go and people have very, very limited bandwidth. They've got very limited time. They're trying to feed their kids. They just want to know, what can you do for me? And so I think Keir Starmer is right to say, that number one, it sounds very vacuous. Stability, tough spending rules, and a stable economy. When I, as a journalist, go to meet economists, city economists, bankers, that really resonates with them, because we've got a little bit of growth, thank goodness, a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. But what we need to know, if you're an investor, what you need to know is, can I invest with confidence in wind farms and solar power and bring energy bills down, or is everything going to be ripped up in 6 months' time? So if you see, stability and a clear direction of travel is quite important to businesses.
And therefore the rest of us. Paul Mason, pleasure talking to you this Saturday morning, listening to all of that. As I said, it's Sir John Redwood. John, first of all, if I could ask you, what was your take, first of all, of where we're at today, with both of the main parties accusing their opposite numbers of being financially irresponsible?
Well, I think it is good to have a debate. And of course, parties do it in a way that catches the imagination and the headlines. So they accuse each other that their numbers don't add up. And then the public will come to a sensible decision based on who's got the better evidence and the better case. So I think it's a bit odd to criticise parties for trying to make an argument out of how much you want your taxes to go up by, or would you like a tax cut? Is a tax cut affordable? Are Labour spending plans affordable? And clearly Labour have made a mistake here because they said they want to build a nationalised energy company. Well, all the experience of nationalisation is that it is incredibly expensive, and they would end up having to put up taxes just to do that. We've seen that with the nationalised HS2 railway company.
The people in Devon
3 times over budget and way beyond the timelines they said they could achieve for building a railway line, and the taxpayers have been landed with a huge bill for something which still doesn't produce any train services. Or if you look at the nationalised post office, which has been nationalised throughout the last decades, a bill of $1,400 million for losses, and now they want to present the taxpayer with a big bill to pay compensation for all the staff they locked up wrongly, sending them to prison for something they didn't do. So the nationalised model is extremely expensive and dangerous.
But you forget...
Labour are committing us to it if they get into government for this nationalised energy company that probably will be ruinously costly.
The sale of Royal Mail, according to the OBR, cost us something like £2 billion we lost out because it was sold off too cheap. And the people in Devon, for example, currently drinking poisonous water, might complain that they're paying very high prices for water from a privatised company that isn't clean. I mean, there's an argument for or
against. It's got a receipt from the sale of Royal Mail, and it's got a huge bill from keeping the post office nationalised with losses and prison sentences.
But we still lost £2 billion in the sale.
The privatised water companies, yes, they're putting too much sewage into the rivers and the sea, just as the nationalised industry did. The only difference is that with a private sector one, we also have a regulator telling us how bad it is, whereas the nationalised industry didn't even tell you how much sewage they were tipping into the water.
Which is something we could have addressed, perhaps. But what about in terms of the dynamism of the campaign? Is there anything in the Labour 6 pledges or first steps that you think perhaps the Tories should be considering?
Well, no, I mean, most of them are the same as Tories, and we want to get the waiting list down, and we are producing more doctors' appointments. Indeed, the rate of increase in doctors' appointments under the Conservatives is very similar to the one that Labour is pledging. And then you've got this idiotic pledge from Labour that they will set up a special small boats border force with a commander. Don't they follow the news? Over a year ago, that's exactly what the Conservatives did. They appointed a special commander and gave many more staff in order to tackle the small boats and cooperate with the French. That is current policy. So are they going to sack all the ones we appointed if they get into office and appoint different ones? That would be a very expensive, silly thing to do.
What about the what we've heard so far? And I have made it clear that I believe that Sunak is clearly keeping some of his powder dry, or I'd like to think so. What should the Tories be doing? At the moment, the message only seems to be tax cuts, and Jeremy Hunt has given us, 3 cuts to national insurance that have done little to boost Tory fortunes. Maybe he needs to change the message.
Well, what the Conservatives should be doing is governing well, because I hope we will be governing until, say, November. And November is the date I've got in my mind for the general election. And we have a mandate to govern for 5 years. And there are still obviously important things we need to do, because the period of government for the Conservatives was knocked sideways by COVID and the Ukraine war, and meant that a lot of things we wanted to do or wanted to afford were put on the back burner while we had to just deal with these national and international crises. So there are plenty of things the Conservatives should be doing. I do think there's scope for more tax cuts, and I would start by rolling back the enormous losses of the Bank of England, which I think are a disgrace, and quite a lot of those losses are avoidable, and I'd want to free that money. And I do think the reforms the Conservatives are introducing to help and encourage many more people back into work are very important. And one you haven't mentioned today, which I think is a great policy the Conservatives have at last embarked upon, is making a big reduction in legal migration. We don't want to be inviting in hundreds of thousands of people to do low-paid jobs, and we've got people at home that would welcome jobs, and when we need a productivity revolution so that people are better trained and have more capital investment behind them so that we have well-paid jobs. That, I think, is extremely welcome and very different from the Labour approach.
So, John Redwood, pleasure talking to you this Saturday morning. Now, what do you make of that, dear listener?